Good afternoon and good evening for those on the East Coast. And it's morning in Asia. Thanks for joining us today. So I'm Gi-Wook Shin. I'm director of Georgetown Asia Pacific Research Center, also director of Korea program here at Stanford. So I'd like to welcome all of you to this panel on prospects for the Biden administration's North Korea policy. As you know, the Biden administration has to announce its North Korea policy, and it remains unclear, whether it will try to forge a new path in dealings with North Korea or retread the steps of previous administrations. In particular, people are wondering if the new administration will pursue anything but Trump approach, return to strategic patience, or something in between. In today's panel, for experts with extensive experience with North Korea will assess the current situation regarding U.S. policy toward North Korea and provide recommendation to the new administration. So some of you may remember that we had a similar seminar with the same 4 people last year, right before the election. And it was so well received that we brought them back again to this panel. So briefly, let me introduce our panelists. First, Bob Carlin. He is a visiting scholar at the Center for International Security and Cooperation here at Stanford. And Victor Cha, a professor of government at Georgetown University and Korea chair at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And Siegfried Hecker, a senior fellow emeritus at FSI and professor in the Department of Management Science Engineering. And finally, Oriana Mastro on FSI APARC Center Fellow. So regarding format for today, there won't be any presentation by the panelists, but we will engage discussions among us and address questions from the audience. So please send your questions via question box. Okay, now let's start with assessment of the current situation, especially where we stand now in North Korea, China, US, and our allies. So maybe it may be good to start with Bob to talk about current situation in North Korea, maybe in terms of politics and economy. Bob, can you start?
I can. Thank you, Gi-Wook. I'm glad you organized this again. There's actually precious little to say about North Korea, I think. So let me begin not looking at where we are, but where we aren't. Because I think the comparison with last year is very instructive. Last year, at this time, March 9th, Kim Jong-un had already been to 3 artillery strike drills in February and in early March. Just looking ahead, he attended 2, 3, 4 more military drills in March and April. Significant ones. These were not visits to KPA farms or looking at the troops in their headquarters. These were drills out in the field, live fire exercises, firepower competition drills. So he was very active in the military last year at this time. This year, so far, nothing. And in fact, if we sort of back up a little bit, we want to remind ourselves that in October last year, in November, in December, in January, and February, there was no surprise. There was nothing overtly provocative going on. Now, that's not a prediction, things can change any day, but it's worth bearing in mind and watching the future on the basis of how he's avoided his military side up until now. Where we are is by comparison quite interesting in terms of the party. From April last year until today, Kim has convened 22 high-level party meetings. That's the Congress plenums, what they call executive party councils, policy councils, and the Central Military Commission. That's in 12 months, 22 meetings. Now compare that with the previous 4 years. He had only 8 meetings. That's an astounding increase in high-level meetings. And something is different. Something is going on. He is, I think, very serious about reorganizing, re-energizing, and refocusing the party, and through the party, the rest of the organization. He convened last week. He convened something he called a short course for chief party secretaries at the city and the county level. These are not high-level people. These are the people who are actually going to implement the decisions that have been made at the party Congress. This is a key group of people, and he called them to Pyongyang to sit and talk to them for 4 days. I think this is part of a house cleaning and a party renovation process. He began it in the summer, and he has continued it straight through. I think we saw evidence of what he had in mind in the party Congress in terms of a long-term plan. I think what Kim is looking for is discipline, focus, motivation, sense of purpose, and accomplishment. He knows that these are tough times. I mean, people on the outside observe it all the time. He's seen it from the inside. He's coming from what had been a fairly productive, positive experience in the economy in 2016 and 2017. I don't think he wants to lose that. There's analysis that at the party Congress, he's stepped away from reform. I don't think that's right. I don't think Kim would do that, but he has to refocus it to meet the current circumstances. And that's why I think maybe he's pulled away from the military and he's trying to get his people focused in a new direction. Where this is going to go, how he's going to respond to Biden, that's all up in the air at this point. But I think it's important to sort of pay attention to the vector he's been on over the last 6-8 months. See if it continues.
Okay, I think that's a great comment. And can you say maybe a little bit about what kind of impact COVID-19 may have had on North Korean economy and people? Do you have any information on that?
We don't have much direct information. There are a lot of people been nibbling at the edges of it. And so far as I can tell, there's a general conclusion that he did a good job closing down the border and putting in place some sort of restrictions on movement and social distancing and masks, whatever they could do. And that's on top of a system which could already pretty well control the people in terms of movement between provinces and stuff. So it certainly looks like they dodged the bullet on COVID. That doesn't mean they've got zero. I would be very surprised if they had zero. But at this point, it really doesn't look like they suffered a massive catastrophe. If they start getting the vaccine coming in, I really expect them to start lifting the restrictions on the border and on imports sometime this year, which is going to make a big difference in terms of the economy.
Okay, so last year we talked about maybe October surprise, and Bob saying still no surprise, but that does mean, I assume, that they're not doing, they're doing nothing, right? So SIC, what's like their status in terms of their nuclear and missile programs and their activities?
Thank you, Gi-Wook. Thanks for putting this on. And on the nuclear front, I would say there have been, at least from what we can tell, no big moves, no big provocations of any sort. There are a few things that you've seen in the news last week as to whether they might be reprocessing, but none of these are unexpected or big changes. However, what we've learned, from the last 20 years for sure, is the nuclear beat just keeps going on and on. And so we can be sure that they're continuing to expand their capabilities, both quantitatively and quantitatively. And I would say, I guess the part that I'd like to offer here, since in the title of this session, you sort of asked the question, is it same old thing or a new beginning? So what I'd like to say, from a North Korean standpoint, the way that I would see it on the nuclear front, I think it is the same old thing, but it's not what you might expect. So it's not this issue of North Korea, nuclear provocations and then extortion and reward as it comes to how the U.S. responds, but rather it's what I've come to believe has been a very distinct approach by North Korea that I would call a dual track approach, dual track of diplomacy and nuclear weapons. So from a diplomacy standpoint, at least I've been very much convinced by people like Bob Carlin that for the last 30 years, the North has been very serious about pursuing sort of a strategic accommodation with the United States. On the nuclear weapons front, however, they've also pursued the continued buildup of their capabilities in order to have a nuclear deterrent against the United States. And at least from my detailed looks at what North Korea has done over the years, the diplomatic and the nuclear weapons approaches, their tracks, have been tightly coupled and incredibly well coordinated. When I look at the American side, essentially the diplomatic or the political and the technical worlds have been uncoupled. And so as a consequence, what I've found is that North Korea over the years has been able to do things that I just never would have imagined that they could do. And so what North Korea has done is it's pursued those dual tracks simultaneously the whole time. Mm-hmm. However, it's put more priority, higher priority on one or the other, depending on essentially what the situation is in the United States, but also affected by sort of regional dynamics and by the domestic situation. And since we've not responded with a good coupling between the technical and the diplomatic world, I think what we've done over the years is we've made some really bad decisions, particularly at various hinge points along the way. And so we failed in some instances to respond firmly to some of the things that North Korea has done where firm response was required. I'll just give you an example. Those are the export issues in the nuclear business with Libya and then building the nuclear reactor in Syria. For whatever reasons, the US just never responded the way that it should have. But then we've also missed many opportunities because we've misjudged or somehow misplayed what the technical or military aspects of what North Korea was doing. And so consequently, I think North Korea has seen this as a pretty successful approach. Dual track, do diplomacy, keep checking and exploring whether there is strategic accommodation with the US. And I would say that's gone on, from 1990 timeframe of Kim Il-sung all the way to the sort of machinations of Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump as far as last year. So I think that exploring was always there, but at the same time, keep the nuclear weapon option going as well. Willing to drop back a little bit at times, but never willing to do so irreversibly. And so what I expect North Korea to do, they've been successful. I think they continue to go along this path. And how the Biden administration responds, I just hope it does it differently than the last few administrations. Because the nuclear situation, as I mentioned, has expanded to the point where we're in much worse situation today. And, just a quick recap, let me just say at the end of the Clinton administration, I believe North Korea had no nuclear weapons. At the end of the Bush administration, a different approach, really tough, killed the agreed framework. The end of the Bush administration, 8 years later, they had maybe 4 to 6 nuclear weapons. Okay, in comes Obama, totally different approach, but still this business of maximum pressure, or at least pressure and sanctions is there. Obama leaves office and North Korea has somewhere around 25 or so nuclear weapons, or at least fissile materials for that many. Trump comes in, different approach in 2017 to 2018 and on. He leaves office and they have enough fissile materials for, let's say, 45 or so nuclear weapons. And so that's the movement that's been there. That's the same old thing. And whatever the US has done with sanctions, maximum pressure, whatever, in my opinion, hasn't worked. It requires a different approach. Let me stop there.
Okay, so thanks, Sig. So it has been now more than 2 years since the summit between Kim Jong-un and Trump in Hanoi. And then obviously there wasn't really any major provocation by North Korea for last 2 years. And you mentioned about missed opportunities. So looking back for last 2 years, was it really missed opportunity for US, for North Korea, or both, or neither?
So my view is, and this is different than I think most people in Washington, is that Hanoi was one of those really big missed opportunities. And actually, let me put Hanoi together with one of the letters that Kim Jong-un sent to Trump. And that was in September of 2018, where he actually said that he would work towards sort of doing away with the Nuclear Weapons Institute. Well, we don't know exactly what that is, but the Yongbyon director that I met, Lee Hang-sup, when I was over in North Korea, he's the head of the Nuclear Weapons Institute. And my suspicion is with the Nuclear Weapons Institute, it's the brain center of their nuclear weapons program. It's like a Los Alamos. And so Kim Jong-un made that offer and nobody heard about this, at least that I know, until the Bob Woodward book. That's where it was. And then at Hanoi, Kim Jong-un offers up to essentially shut down all of Yongbyon. It took a while for him to get there. And Madam Che, the vice minister, had to go out and ask Kim Jong-un, is actually all of Yongbyon on the table? The answer was yes. Of course, not the whole nuclear weapons program, but when you offer up those sorts of things that you're willing to do to take that nuclear weapons program backward, I think it was a real mistake for us not to follow up. So that's the missed opportunity.
Okay, so we'll come back to United States soon, but let me turn to Oriana. What about China? Do they really pay attention to this issue for now? Or what's going on between Pyongyang and Beijing, if there's anything? Can you share your insight on that?
Well, thank you, Gi-Wook, for inviting me. Does China follow these issues? Absolutely. But not in the way that many might think. For China, the North Korea issue has always been about great power competition with the United States and trying to achieve what looks like on the surface conflicting objectives, right? They want to, on one hand, look very useful, right? Be a partner in resolving this issue. On the other hand, not push North Korea too far. And so if you look at the past couple of years, after the fire and fury and all this diplomacy, it is kind of interesting because for better or for worse, the past year has been one of great change in Chinese strategy and policy, especially for its neighbors. We've seen China fly an unprecedented amount of sorties in Taiwan airspace. They have crippling sanctions against the Australians. There were even uses of force against the Indian border. But when it comes to the North Korea issue, the problem for the United States isn't that there's been a lot of change in China's position. It's actually the opposite. It's that everything is exactly the same. China briefly diverted from this policy that I'm going to outline when they were concerned that the United States was preparing a unilateral attack against North Korea, right, in 2017 with some of the fire and fury. But now that the United States has pulled away from that, they've gone back to this balancing act. So take their relationship with North Korea. We know the two countries have not been on good terms the past few years. Technically, they have a treaty which automatically renews every 20 years, but this has no power in practice. It's just politically difficult to stop that automatic renewal. The Chinese government has distanced itself from the alliance in the past, stating things like if North Korea is the one to provoke the conflict, China has no obligation anyway to defend North Korea. And so there's been many of these statements. And in the past couple of years even, we saw a flurry of activity in 2018, 2019. And this gave many people the impression that China and North Korea were well on their way to repairing and normalizing the relationship, right? Xi and Kim met for the first time ever in March 2018. This was Kim's first time meeting any world leader. And then they had 4 meetings to follow, right? In May and June of 2018, January and June of 2019. And so we think that this means they're going to repair the relationship. But instead, it's been very consistent. If you look at what Xi Jinping has said about North Korea, he sends congratulatory messages upon the founding of, of the country. Kim reciprocates in kind. There's a lot of platitudes here, but we can continue to see a strain in the relationship. The 70th anniversary of China's entrance to the Korean War was this year, so this really provided a great excuse to express a newfound closeness. And of course, I think if it wasn't for COVID, we might have seen these two leaders actually meet again this year to commemorate the conflict. But it's not just these social distancing requirements that have kept these two leaders, apart. They could have ramped up propaganda, but they didn't do that. Xi Jinping has not referred to North Korea as an ally. In 2019, he described the relationship as one of, quote, friendly cooperative relations. And one of my favorites is just in January of this year, and on a call, he referred to the relationship or characterized it as, quote, friendly socialist neighbors linked by mountains and rivers. Right. So this is this is just sort of stating the obvious nature of their geography. It's a far cry from them being close. So I think when it comes to the personal relationship, that has stayed exactly the same, right? Xi and Kim are not close, but Xi finds it necessary to maintain that relationship to have a degree of control over what North Korea does because it impacts them in their relationship with the United States. When it comes to managing this issue internationally, same thing. China's continued the same dance. They want to come off as a team player. So we know they voted in favor of some of the harsh sanctions against North Korea in 2017. Donald Trump even praised China in 2019 for being, a big help in dealing with North Korea. But then, recently, the United States has laid out very clearly that China has basically circumvented these sanctions. There's a couple of UN reports that lays out that China, violated the sanctions to supply North Korea with oil, helped them sell coal, things of that sort. Probably 2020, we will see a reduction in economic ties between China and North Korea, but this is not because Beijing has had a change of heart, but because North Korea, after COVID, basically shut down the border. So the last thing I'll just say is that, the biggest variable in what China is trying to do is the United States. Beijing is primarily motivated by the desire to counter US power in the region. The nuclear issue gives them a pretext to call for a reduction of US military presence and activity. They claim that North Korea would stop their weapons development if North Korea was less threatened. So that's where this comes in. President Trump shook this up with the fire and fury approach. It caused China to make some changes. So the big question for the Biden administration as they reevaluate this policy is Biden's approach going to spark such a change in Beijing? If they, for example, move away from focused on complete denuclearization to arms control regime, right, that could change some of the calculus in Beijing and cause them either to get closer to North Korea, to put more pressure on North Korea, depending on where the winds blow. But until we see what that new approach is from the Biden administration, and unless it is a significant departure from things that the United States has done in the past, China is just going to continue to do the same old thing, which is try to maintain the situation and the status quo for as long as possible.
So sounds like then we may go back to old story, but now looks like Biden is going to continue to press China in the sense maybe not easier than Trump. Then do you think we can get some cooperation from China regarding North Korea policy, or still this big power competition will hurt collaboration in dealing with North Korea?
China tries to check the box, right? So if it's possible that they can cooperate with the United States without reducing their influence on the peninsula, they'll do that. But one of the things that they've been reluctant to do is to pressure the regime too much, because in their mind, if the regime collapses, it's possible that just gives the United States more leverage and influence in the region. The United States doesn't have to worry about the North Korean threat. They might consolidate their control and their influence over the whole Korean Peninsula then. So from China's perspective, unless there's an outcome that leads to them having more power and influence on the peninsula than they have today, they're not really willing to press for that kind of change. So yeah, will they say that they're on board with some sanctions? If it looks really important to Biden, they'll do that, but nothing that's going to substantially change North Korean behavior unless the Chinese see, unless there's some sort of discussion or accommodation between the United States and China about what the future of the peninsula looks like.
Okay, so now let's go to Washington from Beijing. So Victor, you are in Washington, so you may hear something different than us in California. But we don't really see much about North Korea from DC, and we hear about China, but not much of North Korea. So what's going on? Are they paying any attention to North Korean issue, or they just set aside, at least for the time being, because there are so many other pressing issues? And then what about any discussion with Tokyo or Seoul regarding North Korea? So what's your take?
So thanks. I also want to convey my thanks to Gi-Wook FSI and APARC for hosting this. So yes, I'm in Washington, but I'm kind of holed up in my home in Washington. No one's getting around much, although I will see some folks later this week. So I think they are focused on North Korea. There's as has been reported in the press, there's a policy review that is underway. I think there's a pretty strong Asia team that's being formed both at NSC and at the State Department. And it's being staffed by people who actually have had, for better or for worse, a lot of experience on the North Korea issue, even though they may not necessarily all be Korea hands. They have been involved in past negotiations, so they kind of can hit the ground running. What the policy review will churn out. Bob's been a part of policy reviews before. These things, they're often lionized in the press, but what they actually produce is, perhaps sometimes underwhelming. I think the policy review doesn't operate in a vacuum. So if North Korea does do something, and we're only a little over a month since the inauguration, and historically North Korea, we're still within the window of when North Korea can carry some sort of provocation out. That's naturally going to affect the outcome of the policy review, as it has done in past administrations. So, So there's a lot still to be determined there. If I had to make one prediction about the policy review, I would say that one of the main mandates that will come out of the review will be to focus on thinking about North Korea policy through our alliances rather than over the heads of our alliances, which, some would argue what the Trump administration did in President Trump talking directly to Kim Jong-un and making promises that leveraged alliance equities that admittedly he didn't care about, right? He didn't value any of the alliance equities with South Korea, whether it was exercising or troops or extended deterrence or any of those things. It didn't really matter to him. So he's happy to decouple. And so I think one of the main things that would come out of the review is that this is something that has to be closely coordinated with particularly Tokyo and Seoul. And, and I think that will be one of the main topics of conversation, when this reported, and it's reported in the press, the likelihood that there will be a visit by Secretary Blinken and the Defense Secretary in the near future to the region, right? It's sort of 2+2 visit to the region. I would imagine this would be one of the main areas or topics of conversation. Could I just pick up on one thing that you asked earlier, Gi-Wook, about COVID and the impact of COVID? Because I know we're all guessing at this, but I think it could have a more of an outsized impact than we really are considering. That could complicate both U.S. and Chinese diplomacy when it comes to North Korea and South Korea, for that matter. And that's because the latest WHO COVAX reports came out, and North Korea still claims they have 0 cases, and they very well may have 0 cases. But if there's one country that has been affected by COVID without being afflicted by COVID, it's North Korea, in the sense that the border has been shut down now for well over a year. And we all know the figures on economic contraction in North Korea, and these sorts of things. And so, this is, when we say the border is sealed, it is sealed, right? There's nothing going across the border. Stuff has been sitting on the border, including medicine, just sitting on the other side of the border. And the reason this matters for the United States and China is that the traditional levers of diplomacy that we might use either to engage or to coerce North Korea, that is trying to gin up more Chinese sanctions or trying to lift U.S. sanctions, as the North Koreans asked for in Hanoi and in 2019. These sorts of things are, for the duration of this pandemic, really moot, because North Korea has placed the heaviest sanctions on itself in terms of completely sealing itself off. So the United States can talk about lifting, 2016, 2017 UN general trade sanctions, but it won't really mean anything now and for the foreseeable future, because I don't see North Korea opening up for a while. And I don't even think they will be able to open up by the end of this year. COVAX has promised, or not even promised, they have forecast that they would get vaccines to North Korea sometime in the summer, but that would cover only about 4% of the population. They would even if they gave it to their traders and to their elites, that still wouldn't allow them to feel comfortable opening up general trade again with China. South Korea is trying to amass, I think, something like 79 million doses of the vaccine, or enough doses for 79 million people, right? That's more than the population of South Korea. So clearly, what the agenda is there, right? Is that they're going to try to help North Korea as well. But President Moon has said they can't vaccinate everybody till November. And it would be political suicide to offer vaccines to North Korea when he hasn't vaccinated everybody in South Korea. So this could mean the border could stay closed for quite a long time, which would make it very difficult to either make diplomatic progress with North Korea or even to sanction North Korea. And so that's why I think this is more of a variable than when we're talking about what's new and what's not new. This is something that I think is new, and we need to look at it. We need to look at it more carefully. And then finally, on South Korea, I'll say, as you know well, President Moon has a little more than a year left in office. They're increasingly desperate to make progress on North Korea. I think they feel like they're skating on thin ice, because if North Korea does carry out some sort of missile launch or something, that could delay diplomacy for 6 months to a year, which basically would render his time of office done. They've got all this additional pressure to try to get vaccines up and running before April, where they have these two big by-elections that could effectively determine whether Moon will be lame duck for the rest of his time in office. So they're feeling a lot of pressure. I imagine they're trying to think of all sorts of creative ways, including with Tokyo, if there's an Olympics in the summer, to try to use the Tokyo Olympics to bring the North Koreans there. They're in a very complex and almost desperate situation, I think, when it comes to North Korea diplomacy.
Okay, thanks, Victor. So you already mentioned that this restoring collaboration with the allies will be important to Biden administration. But I think this question to everyone on the panel. So who will be what will be main agenda or issue? What will be main challenges? And then what are factors affecting Biden's policy toward North Korea?
Well, I think in terms of the alliance, I mean, the things that need to be done within the alliance, and one of them has already been in the news, possibly getting a burden sharing agreement done. These things are important. I think on North Korea, there are two things that come to mind. One is, again, given this real desire on the part of the Moon government to try to make some progress on diplomacy, trying to coordinate, between the United States. You have a new administration that's, going to be cautious when it comes to North Korea. And you have a Moon administration that has already experienced all of the summit diplomacy and wants to try to keep that going. So trying to coordinate that it's going to be challenging. I think it's going to be quite challenging. The other thing I think in terms of the alliance is the whole question of extended deterrence. The South Koreans who look at this sort of stuff, strategic thinkers in Korea, the thing that most impressed them, not in a positive way, about Kim Jong-un's Workers' Party Congress speech in January was the mention of tactical nuclear weapons, which suggests possibly the desire to have some sort of warfighting capability with nuclear weapons. And that has, I think, slowly started to change the terms of discussion in South Korea about talking more about nuclear options if there isn't credible U.S. extended deterrence. So I think one of the things that the Biden administration will want to focus on, and it's natural for them to do so because they're all about rejuvenating the alliances, will be to try to strengthen extended deterrence with the allies, with South Korea and Japan, because there's more discussion about this in South Korea, and because the North Korean stated objective for tactical nuclear weapons. Trump's decoupling of the whatever it was 30 short-range ballistic missile tests from the Hanoi summit till the end of his time in office, completely discounting those as meaningless and not important for U.S. Homeland Security, just laid open this notion that the United States could decouple from South Korean security when it comes to ballistic missiles. So even though Trump's not here anymore, I think that always sits in the minds of South Koreans, and I think will be a priority issue in terms of discussions with the United States.
So what else will be important on Biden's policy toward North Korea?
So if I can just weigh in on one sort of issue, and this I think is more of a political issue in the United States, and so far I haven't heard that Biden's really gonna. There's been rumors that he's moving in this direction, but I haven't seen any confirmation. My viewpoint is that North Korea is never going to give up its nuclear weapons. I think I've mentioned this in other form. I mean, I find it depressing a bit that I wrote on this topic for my undergraduate honors thesis when I was a student at CISAC, right? Like decades and decades and decades ago. So it seems like realistically, the United States has to move in a different direction. For me, the priority is ensuring that they don't have that nuclear capability against the United States, or one that they find reliable and credible. So stopping the ICBM and maybe rolling back that program, and then moving more towards an arms control type of situation. Politically, this idea of like rewarding North Korea by basically treating it as a de facto nuclear state, the Biden administration, I think, would be concerned that they would get politically destroyed for it. So they're just gonna, but that's what has to be done. I mean, in my view, I just don't see what else we can possibly do. And just as a side note, our priority is strategic competition with China, and the United States cannot afford to fight a major war on the Korean Peninsula and effectively compete with China and Asia. We do not have the resources, whether it's manpower, money, personnel, military equipment, or what have you. So, strategy is about trade-offs. And in my mind, if you protect the US homeland, that enhances the credibility of our extended deterrent, because it tells our allies, don't worry about whether we're willing to trade Los Angeles, for Pyongyang, because Los Angeles is not in the picture. And then we move to try to, protect, against nuclear use. And I think that's the best we could do. But it seems like politically, Biden might have had to have a greater mandate or, more confidence in his position domestically to make such a change that surely, the conservatives are just going to destroy him for if he goes in that direction.
Okay, so Sig and Bob, so in order to avoid our missing opportunity again, so what would you suggest to Biden team as they review and formulate a new policy? Is there anything more creative, anything new, or just old story with the new actors?
I think, as with Sig, I think we missed an opportunity, but in a slightly different way. I've been looking at North Korean economic discussions internal for over the last 5 years pretty closely. And it's clear to me that Kim Jong-un was extremely serious about changing economic policy in reformist type ways. And that's the sort of thing that we should have had in mind and should have explored and should have seen if there were some docking points there that we could have used as a basis for discussions with the North Koreans. We didn't do it. We are so fixated on the nuclear issue. We're hypnotized by it. And as Oriana suggests, that train has left the station. It doesn't do us any good to focus in the same way. To suggest that somehow we're going to be able to do that via alliance management, I really think we bleed off so much energy on worrying about the alliances, when in fact it's my sense that Tokyo and Seoul would be perfectly happy to follow the United States if in fact we had a coherent, practical policy. We don't have to do over coordination. We got to talk to them. It's got to be our policy. They have to see us in front and know that we are protecting ourselves and therefore them. If we want to listen to each one of these cats complain about its own particular problems, it's just going to tie us in knots. So I think we need the priority. We need to know what U.S. wants to accomplish, and they don't have a clue right now. They got to settle that, and then other things will begin to fall into place. But you got to know what's going on inside North Korea other than the nuclear issue.
So, Sig, this was a question from the audience,
So, let me just sort of jump on what Oriana said and then also what Bob said. To me, in the nuclear arena right now, whether he's going to give up nuclear weapons or not, who knows? He doesn't even know, in my opinion, but I'm certainly not counting on it anytime in the near future. What we need to do is to make sure that nuclear weapons are not used. And so from my standpoint, what I would do from a Biden administration standpoint is just like North Koreans have adopted a dual track strategy, we should have a dual track strategy. And the lead on that dual track would be diplomacy. And I would also not back that lead of diplomacy with the maximum pressure or sanctions, but I'd rather use sanctions relief as a way to accomplish what we need to do in the diplomatic arena. The pressure that I would see, the second track, so one track is diplomacy, the second track actually has to be a recognition that the nuclear world in North Korea has changed so dramatically from 20 years ago. They do have all those capabilities. And as Victor was saying, they talk about tactical nuclear weapons. And of course, they have tactical nuclear weapons in terms of missiles, but are they going to have battlefield nuclear weapons? That's all the wrong direction to go for sure. So what we need to do on the second track is first deterrence. And for heaven's sakes, we can deter North Korea with our nuclear weapons. We deter China, we deter Russia. But along with deterrence, I'd also counsel for dissuasion in order for them, not to get ideas of where they can push the envelope. Dissuasion through the conventional capabilities and building up the strength of the alliance. And so that's the part that I think is important. That's where I would go with the alliance partners to make sure that we have the conventional capabilities, that they believe in them as much as we do, so that we can not only deter North Korea, but also dissuade. And then that would give us more of a range of diplomatic options that we can go ahead and explore.
So this is a question actually from my students. Now it's easy to just dismiss what Trump has done regarding North Korea, but still people wonder is there anything we can build on. For example, the summit with Kim Jong-un, and obviously a lot of criticism about just show and media attention. But still, one could argue that bringing in North Korea, especially Kim Jong-un, to international community was an achievement. Now we know, I think, more, and better, about North Korea, especially its leader Kim Jong-un. So, is there anything you can build on Trump policy, or we have to just, take anything but Trump approach? I mean, what would you suggest?
I think the Trump approach was effective in a lot of ways. The first one is he credibly signaled the United States' willingness to use force on this nuclear issue. The Chinese, I believed we were willing to use force. The Chinese believed that the United States was willing to use force. And that's why you got a much higher degree of Chinese cooperation, pressure on the North Korean regime from the Chinese on one hand, but also it's that panic that led Xi Jinping to meet with Kim for the first time. Because when the United States was willing to have a direct connection with North Korea, then that China's power to leverage the issue to their strategic advantage decreased. So Xi had to strengthen his position with Kim so he could continue to use North Korea to his advantage. So it definitely was successful in that it threw the Chinese off. It forced them to move away from, the same strategy that they've had forever. Now, other people on this panel have commented that it was kind of a squandered opportunity in terms of then the negotiating aspects of it. But I think, that direct link with North Korea that takes China out of the loop does reduce China's ability to manipulate the situation to their behavior. And I think if you also look at the China team or the advisors to President Biden, these are very pragmatic individuals that know China very well. I don't think anyone is under the impression now that China is going to do the United States any favors in this issue. So President Trump was very good at a credible threat. I think President Obama was very good with credible assurance, right? The United States is not going to attack you for no reason. But as we know, deterrence requires both a credible threat and credible assurance. So hopefully Biden will combine these previous approaches to reassure and threaten credibly at the same time so that we can establish this deterrent that we need against nuclear use.
So after the Singapore summit, I think I was one of the few people that actually wrote positively about it, right? That I thought it was, you know, they were now testing the hypothesis that had not been tested yet, right? Which was for the two leaders to negotiate directly on this. You know, the problem, I think, as a number of people have said, is that the opportunity is squandered in part because the president was too lazy to actually do the work to understand what the issue was about, and that, you know, there was no real follow-up on those negotiations in ways that could have resulted in some substantive progress. I mean, the result of that is, I think it has now put China in a stronger position vis-a-vis North Korea, because the North Korean leader had 3 summit meetings with the US president and got nothing for it, right? Nothing, absolutely nothing. And so that, you know, if she was concerned he was going to get cut out of a US-North Korea deal, you know, which then prompted him to have 4 meetings with Kim when he didn't have any before the March 2018 announcement that Trump was going to meet Kim. You know, the Chinese are sitting pretty right now, in the sense that they probably feel like they're in a much better position than they were before. You know, I think, I agree. I mean, I think the Biden administration is filled with a bunch of pragmatists. They're not a bunch of ideologues. But the political obstacles are very real, as Oriana said. I mean, all those Republicans that were saying, let's give Kim a chance when Trump was president, will now be the hardest hardliners the minute anybody mentions the word threat reduction, right, or arms control. Right. But I still think that there's a way to fashion a policy that you can talk about denuclearization as still being the goal, but you still have to work your way there. Right. And everybody knows, you know, there has to be a freeze, and then you have to start thinking about some other steps. You know, I have advocated that, you know, after the first stage of reestablishing a freeze, rather than pushing hard again for a verifiable nuclear inventory or these other sort of rabbit holes that we've gone down in previous negotiations, we should shift tracks to the political relationship and try to affect change on the political relationship, so that these later steps, whether it's arms control, test ban, fissile material production, kind of these sorts of things, can be negotiated between 2 countries that are less distrustful of each other, rather than trying to negotiate them between 2 hostile adversaries. Much harder to do. But again, the political climate doesn't really afford that. If this were to take place in a vacuum, the negotiation were to take place in a vacuum, it'd be, you know, these, I think, would all be feasible steps. I think they're much harder today.
Well, I like what Victor just said. You know, from a standpoint of changing the game, you know, away from the CVID, it was just never realistic. In terms, though, of Victor said, of sort of getting a freeze, and I guess, Victor, by what you mean, at least to sort of keep the lid on things for now until one can develop the political relationships to move it in the right direction. You know, what I've seen in looking back, what the North Koreans have offered over the years, they've been willing to do more than a freeze. So they've been actually willing to do some rollback. And then we've passed up those opportunities. And so instead of rolling back, then the North Koreans just kept rolling forward. And so I think what you suggest is a good idea.
Bob?
I think that unless there's some vision, we need more than pragmatism. I like pragmatism. And I agree with Victor, but we need more than that. We need vision and leadership. And we cannot hear from the White House that, well, the president's plate is full. That's not an excuse in this situation, because if the president's plate is full, then the North Koreans, as Sig said, will just move ahead. And then the president will be in a worse position. So they have to make a decision early on that they're going to work hard on this, and they're going to think new thoughts about the pussycat. And unless they do that, unless that comes out of this review, then I worry that we'll be stuck. And you got to add to that the things that Victor suggested about how our leverage has been diminished in the middle of COVID. I think they're going to open sooner than he does. But even so, unless Kim is prepared to really throw open the borders, it's going to be, what is it going to mean if we say we're going to lift sanctions? He'll say, thank you very much, but I can't use that right now. So we got to figure out, we've got a lot of reconnaissance to do with the North Koreans right now. And I don't think we know what they want because we can't sit down and listen to them. We got to figure out a way to do that at some level in some country in the world.
Okay, so let me ask one final question. I'm mindful of the time, and we had this conversation 6 months ago. Okay, so if we were to do again 6 months later, let's say October, November this year, what would you expect? So we are recording this one, so we double check who's right, who's wrong. So do you think more or less the same as now, or we see some change? I mean, what would you expect 6 months from now?
So I'll just weigh in, and Victor will say more about the South Korean relationship, but I expect that other aspects that are not denuclearization will have improved. Like I expect that the South Korean U.S. relationship will be stronger. I suspect that, we will have done a better job reassuring our partners in Japan about, the U.S. commitment to their defense. I suspect that the U.S.-China relationship is those tensions are going to remain. The Biden administration doesn't seem to be interested in a complete reset, and that probably, and I hate to say this before they come out with it, and I want to give them the benefit of the doubt, but I doubt that the new North Korea policy, because of all the political challenges we've laid out, is going to be such a diversion from what we've done in the past that it will lead to, a recalibration in Beijing. So I think regionally, the United States is going to be in a better position to deter North Korea and have allied partners support, and China will be, maybe they have more leverage in that particular issue, but they're not going to feel so happy about some of the coalition building that's occurring. But I doubt we're going to be closer to denuclearization than we are today.
Gi-Wook, if I add, I think on the nuclear front, what I would expect is that they'll just keep rolling along in this 6 month time frame. As I look at it right now, there are several things. If I were running their nuclear weapons program, there are several things that are needed right now. They're going to do some of these things regardless. They're not going to do it for the sake of provoking the United States, but they're going to do it for the sake of just moving their program along. So, for example, right now, they have none of their reactors operating. They're trying like hell to get those operating again. They're going to work in that direction. They're going to continue to spin the centrifuges to make highly enriched uranium. They can continue to work on hydrogen bombs and smaller, warheads. And so they do have to test, their big long-range ICBM missiles. And they probably have to do some more solid motor, shorter range tests. And so which ones of those we do, we don't know for sure. But they're certainly going to move in that direction unless the Biden administration really gets in and clicks with them to say, hey, look, let's take some diplomatic actions to start rolling that stuff back. Otherwise, it's going to roll on.
Bob and Victor, yeah.
Well, just to go back to the Congress, in his remarks, Kim made very clear that he thought that Singapore still was a basis for some sort of engagement with the Americans. Seems to me that needs to be followed up, and I suspect it will get us a positive response. It won't get us everything we want, but it will give us some traction, and then we can see where we go from there.
So you're saying that can be good kind of a baseline to build on for Biden policy towards North Korea.
Yeah, I think so.
So, Victor, you have final words.
So I want to thank Oriana for going first, because I agree with everything that she said about the alliances and about the relationship with China. Two additional points. One is that I think the August exercises will be an important pivot point, because right now, the current exercises, for COVID and a variety of other reasons, these have been toned down quite a bit. And so they're not really going to be something that would might be responded to by North Korea. But by August, I think a lot more folks will be vaccinated both in the U.S. and South Korea, and that's there may be more exercises then, and the North Koreans could react to those, which would set back could set back diplomacy. I'm not hoping for that, but it's one of the things that I'm concerned about. And then the last point I'd make is that I think, as Bob said, to say your plate is full is really not an answer. But the other thing we often hear is that, look, the priority is not North Korea, the priority is China, right? That's that when they look at Asia, that's a priority. And that, many South Korean officials who come over lobbying for engagement, they don't understand that that's the policy. But the one thing I would say there is that, if there's a way we should merge our North Korea policy and our China policy review, in the sense that, as I agreed with Oriana earlier, China is in a pretty strong position on the Korean Peninsula right now. And so if we're looking at our North Korea policy through the lens of US-China competition, how can we reduce Chinese influence and on the Korean Peninsula, particularly over North Korea on the Korean Peninsula? Combining those two things might be another argument for some sort of engagement with North Korea, because they're in a pretty strong position on the peninsula right now.
All right, so thank you so much for sharing your insights. And as I said, now we reconvene 6 months from last time. So maybe we can come back 6 months later, maybe to see what we have said today, and then go from there. So thank you so much for joining us, also in the audience to join us, and then have a great evening. And then I have to see you again soon. Thank you. Thank you so much.